A millionaire in critical condition fell in love with his nurse. When she revealed her true identity at the hospital, he was left paralyzed. The annual charity gala at Fairhope Memorial Hospital was in full swing when Victoria Anderson made her grand entrance. Fashionably late as always. Her designer dress probably cost more than most nurses made in a month. And she knew it. Her husband Richard, the tech millionaire who had donated the hospital's new wing, watched nervously as she approached the podium to make her opening speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria's voice dripped with fake warmth, "we're here tonight to celebrate our wonderful medical staff." Her eyes swept across the room, landing on Mrs. Henderson, a 75-year-old retired nurse who still volunteered at the hospital. The elderly woman was wearing a simple dress that had seen better days. What happened next would change everything. Though some of us, Victoria continued with a slight sneer, should know when it's time to step aside and let younger, more qualified people take over. She stared directly at Mrs. Henderson. "We can't have outdated practices holding us back, can we?" The room fell silent. Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears. She had dedicated 50 years of her life to this hospital. Richard felt his chest tighten, whether from anger or something else, he wasn't sure. "That's enough, Victoria," he said, standing up. Victoria's perfect smile faltered. "Darling, I'm just being honest about our standards." "I said that's enough." Richard's voice boomed across the ballroom. "Mrs. Henderson has helped more people than you've met in your entire life." A young nurse with kind eyes, her name tag read Grace, quietly appeared at Mrs. Henderson's side, offering support and a tissue. There was something different about her, a quiet confidence that stood out. "Richard, you're making a scene," Victoria hissed, but Richard was already walking toward Mrs. Henderson. "I'm so sorry," he began, but suddenly the tightness in his chest became unbearable. The room started spinning. Richard clutched his chest, gasping for air. "He's having a heart attack." Grace's voice cut through the panic. She was already lowering him to the floor, her movements swift and precise. "Someone call a code blue." Victoria stood frozen, her first instinct to reach for her phone. "This will ruin the gala," she muttered, already typing on social media. "Should I post about thoughts and prayers?" Grace worked with remarkable skill, directing other staff members while monitoring Richard's vitals. There was something about her methods. The way she anticipated every need before anyone else, how she knew exactly which medications to request. It was as if she'd done this 1,000 times before, but not as a nurse. "BP's dropping," someone called out. "Start him on." Grace began giving detailed instructions that seemed beyond typical nurse training. Through his fading consciousness, Richard heard Victoria arguing with someone about which hospital room would look best in photos. His last thought before everything went dark was how he'd gotten it all so wrong. The marriage, the priorities, everything. When he woke up hours later in the cardiac unit, Victoria was gone. Her assistant had texted that she had a pressing engagement at the country club, but Grace was there, checking his vitals with that same quiet efficiency. "Your wife left these," Grace said gently, holding up a stack of business cards. She said people can contact her assistant to send flower arrangements. Richard closed his eyes, the pain in his heart now emotional as much as physical. 30 years of marriage, he whispered. And she couldn't stay for one night. Grace adjusted his pillow with practiced care. "Sometimes life has to break our hearts to show us what really matters," she said softly, and something in her voice made Richard open his eyes again. There was a story there, behind those kind eyes, a mystery he couldn't quite figure out. "Thank you," he said, "for everything tonight, especially standing up for Mrs. Henderson. Victoria can be..." "Hey, Dad," a new voice interrupted them. His twin daughters, Ashley and Emma, stood in the doorway, looking tired and worried. They'd flown in from their respective colleges as soon as they'd heard, no thanks to Victoria, who hadn't even called them. Grace slipped quietly from the room, but Richard noticed his daughters watching her go with curiosity. They'd had so few examples of genuine kindness in their privileged lives. "We found some old letters in Mom's study while looking for your insurance cards," Ashley said hesitantly. "Letters from us at college, dozens of them, unopened." And just like that, another piece of Richard's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The morning after his heart attack, Richard woke up to the sound of Victoria arguing with Grace in the hallway. "I want a different nurse assigned to my husband," Victoria demanded. "Someone more qualified." "Mrs. Anderson, I assure you I'm fully capable. Do you know who we are? We deserve the best care, not some small-town nurse." Grace's response was calm but firm. "Your husband's condition requires specific cardiac monitoring, the combination of beta blockers and—" "See, this is exactly what I mean. Nurses shouldn't be discussing medications. That's for doctors." Richard pressed the call button, ending their argument as Grace came in to check on him. Victoria followed, already dressed for a charity brunch. "The hospital board meeting is today," Victoria announced. "I can't miss it. I'm sure you understand, darling." Before Richard could respond, his daughters walked in. Ashley carried a stack of unopened letters, while Emma held their old report cards and birthday cards, all found in Victoria's study. "Mom," Ashley's voice shook. "Why did you hide these from Dad?" Victoria's perfectly composed face faltered. "Girls, this isn't the time." "When is the time?" Emma demanded. "When you're not busy with your social events?" Grace quietly checked Richard's vitals, but he noticed how she positioned herself near the girls, offering silent support. "Everything I do is for this family," Victoria said. "The connections I maintain, the image I protect." "Image?" Ashley laughed bitterly. "Is that why you sent us to boarding school? To protect your image?" Richard watched the scene unfold, his chest tightening, but not from his heart condition. How had he let this happen? All those years focused on building his tech company, while Victoria built her social empire. They'd lost what mattered most. "I need to check Mr. Anderson's medication," Grace interrupted gently. "Perhaps we could continue this later?" Victoria seized the excuse to leave. "Yes, I'm already late. Girls, we'll discuss this at a more appropriate time." After she left, the room fell silent, except for Grace's efficient movements as she adjusted Richard's IV. "She never opened a single letter," Emma said quietly. 4 years of us writing from college." Grace's hands stilled for a moment. "Sometimes people get so caught up in the life they think they should have, they miss the life that's right in front of them." "You sound like you speak from experience," Richard observed. A shadow crossed Grace's face. "Let's just say I learned the hard way what really matters." Mrs. Henderson appeared at the door with a homemade blanket. "I heard the girls were here," she smiled warmly. "Mrs. Henderson," Grace said, "you didn't have to come in today after." "Nonsense. These halls are my home." She turned to the twins. "I remember when you girls were born, your father was so proud he told every patient in the hospital." Ashley and Emma exchanged surprised looks. They'd never heard that story. "I have photos," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Back when your father would visit the pediatric ward reading stories to the children." "Dad did that?" Emma asked. Richard felt tears forming. It was before everything got so complicated. Grace checked his heart monitor, frowning slightly at the readings. Her reaction seemed more like a doctor's assessment than a nurse's routine check. "Your blood pressure's elevated," she said. "We should probably let you rest." "No," Richard reached for his daughter's hands. "Please stay. I've missed so much already." As his daughters pulled chairs closer to his bed, Mrs. Henderson spread her homemade blanket over him. Grace moved to leave, but Richard noticed how his daughters looked at her, the same way they used to look at their favorite teacher in elementary school. "You can stay too," Ashley said to Grace. "If you're not too busy." "I'd like that," Grace smiled, settling into the background as Mrs. Henderson began sharing more stories about the past. For the first time in years, Richard felt like he was seeing his life clearly. The stark hospital room had become warmer, more real than any of Victoria's carefully curated charity galas. But there was something about Grace, the way she noticed everything, anticipated problems before they arose. She was a mystery he couldn't quite solve, and mysteries were what he did best in the tech world. He just hadn't expected to find one that would change his life forever. Victoria's email to the hospital board never arrived. Instead, she found herself staring at her computer screen, her finger hovering over the send button when her phone rang. "Mrs. Anderson," the voice was unfamiliar. "I'm calling about your foundation's tax records." Victoria's hand began to shake. "Who is this?" "IRS. We've noticed some irregularities with the hospital donations." In Richard's hospital room, Ashley was showing him more documents they'd discovered. Look at these transfers, she pointed to the statement. Mom's been moving money for years, but not just to her social clubs. There's something bigger here. Emma walked in with her laptop. Dad, I think I found something. Remember that children's wing Mom blocked last year? The money went to? A commotion in the hallway interrupted them. Grace was arguing with Victoria. You can't just cancel the pediatric program, Grace insisted. Watch me. The board gave me full authority over non-essential programs. Richard pressed the call button, and both women entered his room. Victoria, he said, we need to talk about the foundation money. Actually, Victoria smiled coldly, we need to talk about your company's involvement in all this. Would the board of Anderson Technologies like to know about those overseas accounts? The room fell silent. Ashley and Emma looked at their father in confusion. What overseas accounts? Ashley asked. Your father isn't as clean as he pretends to be, Victoria said. Should I tell them about Singapore? Richard's heart monitor began beeping faster. Grace moved to check his vitals, but Victoria blocked her path. Stay away from my husband, she snapped. I know what you're hiding, Dr. Thompson. Grace froze. The twins gasped. Doctor, Emma whispered. Former doctor. Victoria corrected with a smirk. Would you like to tell them why you're pretending to be a nurse, or should I? Before Grace could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway. That's enough, Victoria. This doesn't concern you. Actually, it does. Mrs. Henderson stepped into the room. I knew Grace's father. He was chief of surgery here 30 years ago. Victoria's confidence wavered slightly. What? And I knew your mother when she was more than just a society name, Mrs. Henderson continued. She'd be ashamed of what you're doing. Don't you dare. The pediatric program was her legacy. She built it from nothing, and you're destroying it for what? Power? Status? Richard's voice cut through the tension. The Singapore account, he said quietly. It wasn't for me. It was for your shopping trips, wasn't it, Victoria? Victoria's face paled. Richard, I covered for you every time, but no more. Grace checked Richard's monitor again, concern crossing her face. Everyone needs to leave. His blood pressure. No, Richard grabbed her hand. Why did you give up being a doctor? The room grew quiet. Grace looked at Mrs. Henderson, who nodded encouragingly. Because sometimes saving lives means more than a title, Grace said softly. Victoria laughed harshly. Oh, please, tell them the truth. Tell them about the patient you lost. Mom, stop, Emma shouted, but Victoria was on a roll. Tell them why Johns Hopkins let their star surgeon go. Tell them. It was my brother. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. The patient I lost was my brother. Ashley moved to Grace's side. Emma followed. Their instant support made Victoria step back. This isn't over, Victoria warned. Richard, you have until tomorrow to transfer the foundation control to me, or I'm taking everything public. Your company, your reputation. Get out, Ashley and Emma said in unison. After Victoria left, Richard turned to Grace. I'm sorry about your brother. Grace checked his IV. Rest now. We'll talk later. But as she turned to leave, Richard noticed something. On her ID badge, partially covered by her hair, was a familiar name. The same name he'd seen on those diverted donation records. Grace, he called out. The Thompson Children's Fund? That's where Victoria's been sending the money, isn't it? Grace paused at the door. Your wife isn't the only one with secrets, Mr. Anderson. As she left, Mrs. Henderson patted Richard's hand. Sometimes, she said, the biggest hearts carry the heaviest burdens. Ashley and Emma looked at their father. Dad, Ashley said, what are we going to do? Richard watched Grace walking down the hallway, her steps assured despite everything that had just happened. We're going to find out the truth, he said. All of it. The emergency alarms blared through the hospital corridors at 3 a.m. A board member had suffered a massive heart attack during a late-night meeting. BP dropping, a nurse called out. Dr. Stevens isn't responding to his page. Grace rushed into the room, immediately taking charge. Get me epinephrine and prepare the crash cart. You can't give orders, another nurse protested. Protocol states. He's dying. Grace's voice carried the authority of someone used to making life or death decisions. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she began the procedure. Dr. Roberts burst into the room just as Grace stabilized the patient. He watched her work, his expression shifting from concern to recognition. I know those techniques, he he said quietly. Only one surgeon ever used that specific approach, Dr. Sarah Thompson at Johns Hopkins. The room fell silent. Grace stepped back from the patient, her secret finally exposed. "You're Sarah Thompson's daughter," Dr. Roberts continued. "She was a legend in cardiac surgery." Down the hall, Richard was awake, listening to the commotion. His daughters had fallen asleep in the chairs beside him but stirred at the sound of running footsteps. Victoria burst into the room. "Turn on the TV. Now." The local news was running a breaking story. Questions arise about Fairhope Memorial Hospital's mysterious nurse. Sources claim she's actually Dr. Grace Thompson, former chief cardiac surgeon at Johns Hopkins, who left medicine after a patient's death. "Mom, what did you do?" Ashley demanded. "The truth needs to come out," Victoria declared. "She's been lying to everyone." Emma grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. Dr. Thompson resigned from Johns Hopkins 5 years ago after her brother died during a routine procedure. Sources say the TV clicked off. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, remote in hand. "Shame on you, Victoria. The public has a right to know." "Know what?" Grace appeared behind Mrs. Henderson. "That I chose to step down? That after losing my brother, I needed to remember why I became a doctor in the first place?" Victoria smirked. "You mean you couldn't handle the pressure?" "My brother had a rare condition." Grace's voice was steady. "The same condition your husband has, Victoria. One that's often misdiagnosed until it's too late." Richard sat up straighter. "What condition?" "A genetic anomaly that doesn't show up on standard tests. I recognized the signs in you the moment you had your attack. It's why I've been monitoring you so closely." Victoria's confidence wavered. "You're lying." "The Thompson Children's Fund," Richard said suddenly. "That's why you started it, to research this condition." Grace nodded. "After Michael died, I used my inheritance to establish the fund, to help families afford the specialized testing that could save lives. The money I've been transferring," Victoria whispered. "It's been going to—" "Your mother set it up," Mrs. Henderson revealed. "Before she died, she made arrangements for hospital donations to support Grace's research. She knew about Michael." Victoria sank into a chair. "Mom never told me." "She tried," Mrs. Henderson said, "but you were too busy with your social climbing to listen." Ashley and Emma moved to Grace's side. "Is our dad going to be okay?" Ashley asked. "With proper treatment, yes. It's why I came to work here when I learned about his condition. Your grandmother, Victoria's mother, reached out to me." Victoria looked up sharply. "What?" "She knew the signs too. It runs in families, Victoria. Your uncle had it." The news continued to play silently on screens throughout the hospital. Staff members gathered in doorways, watching the drama unfold. "Why didn't you just tell everyone who you were?" Richard asked. "Because sometimes you have to step back to see what's really important," Grace replied. "Being a nurse taught me more about healing than being a surgeon ever did." Dr. Roberts cleared his throat. "The board member you just saved is asking for you. He wants to thank the surgeon who saved his life." Grace hesitated. "I'm not a surgeon anymore. I'm just—" "You're both," Richard interrupted. "And we need both." Victoria stood up suddenly. "This doesn't change anything. I'm still going public with everything tomorrow. The company's secrets, the foundation." "No, you're not," a new voice said. The IRS agent from earlier stepped into the already crowded room. "Mrs. Anderson, we need to talk about those accounts in Singapore." Victoria's face went pale. She looked around the room, at her daughter's disappointment, at Mrs. Henderson's sadness, at Grace's quiet strength, and finally at Richard's resolved expression. "What have I become?" she whispered. The hospital's annual spring benefit was supposed to be Victoria's crowning achievement. Instead, she stood at the podium facing a half-empty room, her usual supporters conspicuously absent. "As chair of the hospital board," her voice wavered slightly, "I want to address the recent rumors about our staff." "You mean how you exposed Dr. Thompson?" someone called out. Victoria gripped the podium tighter. "I believe transparency is important." "Like the transparency of those Singapore accounts?" another voice interrupted. The whispers grew louder. Victoria spotted Grace at the back of the room, checking on elderly patients who'd come to support the hospital despite the scandal. "I demand order," Victoria announced. "As your social chair." "Not anymore." Mrs. Henderson stood up from her seat. "The board voted this morning. You're out, Victoria." The room erupted in murmurs. Victoria's face flushed red. You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? Yes, Mrs. Henderson's voice carried clearly. You're Margaret Anderson's daughter, the woman who built this hospital's pediatric program, the woman who spent every Christmas reading to sick children. Victoria's shoulders sagged. Mother had different priorities. No, Mrs. Henderson moved closer to the podium. She had the right priorities, and she made arrangements to protect them before she died. What are you talking about? Grace stepped forward. Your mother knew about the genetic heart condition in your family. She knew Richard might have it. That's why she arranged for the donations to fund our research. She never told me, Victoria whispered. She tried. Remember that lunch 2 months before she died, when she wanted to discuss the hospital's future? Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. I had a spa appointment. I told her we'd talk later. She died the next week, Mrs. Henderson said quietly. The room fell silent. Even the critics who'd come to witness Victoria's downfall seemed uncomfortable. I've seen the foundation documents, Grace continued. Your mother made you the trustee because she believed in you, Victoria. She believed you'd continue her work. Victoria's carefully constructed facade crumbled. I failed her. I failed everyone. It's not too late, a familiar voice called out. Richard walked into the room, supported by Ashley and Emma. Dad, you should be resting, Emma protested. Some things are more important, he said, approaching the podium. Victoria, look around. This isn't about social status. It's about people. Real people. The elderly patients Grace had been checking on nodded in agreement. They'd known Margaret Anderson, had benefited from her kindness. Your mother built something meaningful here, Richard continued. And Grace has been quietly continuing that work, even while hiding who she really was. Victoria turned to Grace. Why? Why didn't you expose me when you knew about the diverted funds? Because I saw something in you, Grace replied. The same thing your mother saw. Potential. Suddenly, alarms blared. One of the elderly patients had collapsed. Heart attack, Grace called out, rushing to the patient's side. Without hesitation, she began procedures that clearly showed her surgical background. Victoria watched as Grace worked, her movements precise and confident. This was what real power looked like, the power to save lives. She's stabilizing, Grace announced minutes later. The room burst into applause. Victoria stayed frozen at the podium, watching as her carefully constructed social world crumbled around her. The IRS is willing to work with us, Richard said quietly to his wife, but we need to make things right. Victoria looked at her daughters, who stood supporting their father. She looked at Mrs. Henderson, who still held hope in her eyes. She looked at Grace, who had just saved another life while Victoria had been worried about her social position. I want to make things right, Victoria whispered, but I don't know how. Start by telling the truth, the IRS agent suggested, stepping forward. All of it. Victoria nodded slowly, then turned to face the room. My name is Victoria Anderson, her voice shook, and I need to tell you about my mother's real legacy. As Victoria began to speak, Grace slipped out of the room to check on her patient. In the hallway, she ran into Dr. Roberts. We need you back in surgery, he said simply. Grace shook her head. I'm not that person anymore. You're exactly that person, he replied. And we both know there's another Anderson who might need your surgical skills soon. Grace glanced back at Richard, knowing the genetic condition that had killed her brother could strike again at any time. Sometimes she realized, you have to reclaim who you are to save the ones you love. Richard's collapse during Victoria's confession sent the benefit into chaos. Dad! Ashley screamed as her father clutched his chest. Grace pushed through the crowd. Get me a crash cart. Call the OR. Tell them to prep for emergency surgery. Victoria stood frozen at the podium. No, not now, please. His heart's failing, Grace announced, checking vitals. It's the same pattern I saw with Michael. Dr. Roberts rushed in. OR2 is ready. But Grace, you're not credentialed anymore. You can't. She's the only one who knows this condition, Mrs. Henderson interrupted. She's the only one who can save him. The hospital administrator stepped forward. It's against protocol. The liability. My husband is dying. Victoria's voice cut through the chaos. Let her operate. Security guards blocked the path. We can't allow. Move, Emma shouted. She's his only chance. Grace kept working on Richard as they argued. His pulse was weakening. Listen to me, Grace commanded, her surgeon's authority returning. This genetic condition requires a modified bypass procedure. I pioneered it at Johns Hopkins. No one else here knows how to do it. Dad's dying while you debate hospital politics, Ashley cried. Richard grabbed Grace's hand. I trust you, he whispered. The administrator looked at Dr. Roberts. Your call, Chief of Surgery. Do it, he decided. Get her cleared, now. They rushed Richard to the OR. Grace ran alongside, rattling off instructions to the surgical team. Grace, Victoria called out just before the OR doors. Please save him. In the waiting room, Victoria paced while her daughters huddled together on plastic chairs. Tell us about the condition, Emma asked Mrs. Henderson, the one that killed Grace's brother. Mrs. Henderson sighed. It's rare, hard to detect. By the time symptoms show, it's usually too late. But Grace recognized it, Ashley said. After losing Michael, she dedicated her life to studying it. The research fund she started, it's helped identify cases early, saved lives. Victoria stopped pacing. And my mother knew about Richard? She suspected. Family history on his father's side. That's why she arranged the funding. Hours passed. Ashley and Emma dozed fitfully. Victoria stared at old photos on her phone, happy moments she'd forgotten in her pursuit of status. Finally, Grace emerged, still in surgical scrubs. Everyone jumped up. Izzy? The surgery worked, Grace said. We repaired the damage. He's going to be okay. The room erupted in tears and hugs. Even Victoria broke down. Thank you, she sobbed. I've been so wrong about everything. Your mother would be proud, Grace said quietly. What you did today, choosing his life over hospital politics, that's who she raised you to be. Dr. Roberts appeared with paperwork. The board fast-tracked your reinstatement. We want you back, Dr. Thompson. Grace hesitated. I can't just... You can do both, Mrs. Henderson suggested. Surgeon and mentor. This hospital needs both. Ashley and Emma hugged Grace. We need both too, Emma said. There's something else, Victoria said. The foundation. I want to do it right. Help me honor my mother's legacy? Before Grace could answer, a nurse rushed in. Dr. Thompson, Mr. Anderson is asking for you. In recovery, Richard was groggy but alert. He smiled when Grace checked his vitals. So, he mumbled, do I call you doctor or nurse? Call me Grace, she smiled, adjusting his IV. Grace, he said sleepily, I think I'm falling in love with you. The room went still. Victoria, standing in the doorway, heard everything. I'll give you two a moment, Grace said awkwardly, turning to leave. Stay, Victoria said. Please, we all need to talk. Grace looked at her patient, the man she'd saved twice now, at his daughters who watched her with trust and hope, at Victoria, who stood ready to face hard truths. Okay, Grace said, let's talk. Outside the room, Mrs. Henderson smiled. Margaret Anderson had been right all along. Love and truth were the best medicine. Victoria sat alone in the hospital chapel at dawn, staring at her mother's memorial plaque. I used to find you here sometimes, Mrs. Henderson said, entering quietly. Your mother, I mean, early mornings planning her next project. I never knew she came here. There's a lot you never knew. She'd write her ideas in a little notebook, ways to help more families, improve patient care. Victoria pulled something from her purse, a worn notebook she'd found in her mother's desk. Like this one? Mrs. Henderson nodded. She wanted to tell you everything that last week, about Richard's condition, about Dr. Thompson's research. I was too busy planning a charity gala. Victoria's voice cracked. My own husband could have died because I wasn't listening. Down the hall, Grace was reviewing Richard's latest tests when he woke up. You should be sleeping, she scolded gently. Hard to sleep when your life's turned upside down, he smiled weakly. Did I really tell you I was falling in love with you? You were heavily medicated, Grace tried to dodge. Grace, his voice was stronger now. I meant it. She put down his chart. Richard, there are complications here beyond your heart condition. You mean Victoria? She's trying to change. I saw her in the chapel earlier. I know, the girls told me. He took her hand. But our marriage has been over for years. We both knew it. In the chapel, Victoria was still talking with Mrs. Dubb. I want to make things right, she said, but I don't know where to start. Start with the truth, Mrs. Henderson suggested. Victoria nodded, then stood up. I need to talk to Grace. She found Grace and Richard holding hands. Instead of anger, she felt relief. Am I interrupting? Victoria asked. They quickly separated, but Victoria shook her head. Don't. Please. We need to be honest now. She took a deep breath. I saw the way you looked at each other during my mother's funeral, Grace. You were there as a doctor, monitoring Richard's symptoms, but it was more than that, wasn't it? Grace looked down. I never acted on it. I would never. I know. You're a better person than I've been. Victoria sat down. My mother trusted you with her medical proxy. Did you know that? Not me. You. Richard looked surprised. Margaret made you her proxy? Grace nodded. She knew about the heart condition in your family. She wanted someone who would understand the medical implications. She tried to tell me so many times, Victoria said, but I was too busy building my social empire to listen. She pulled out her mother's notebook. I found her plans for the hospital. Everything she wanted to do, everything she hoped I would continue. Ashley and Emma appeared in the doorway. Mom, the IRS agents are here. Victoria stood up. Good, it's time to clean up my mess. She turned to Grace. Take care of him. He deserves someone who sees what really matters. Victoria, Grace called out. Your mother would be proud of you right now. In the hallway, Victoria faced the federal agents with her daughters by her side. She told them everything about the accounts, the diverted funds, all of it. Later that evening, Mrs. Henderson found Grace in Richard's room, checking his vitals. Victoria turned herself in, she announced. Will she face charges? Richard asked. The agents were impressed with her cooperation, and since the money actually went to legitimate research, Mrs. Henderson smiled. They're working out a deal. Grace adjusted Richard's medication. And the hospital board? They voted to keep her on, in a different role. She'll be overseeing the new pediatric research program. If she wants it. Richard squeezed Grace's hand. People can change. Yes, Mrs. Henderson agreed. Love has a way of healing more than just hearts. Grace looked at Richard, then at the chapel across the hall where Victoria was again sitting with her mother's notebook. Sometimes, Grace said, healing means letting go of who you were to become who you're meant to be. Ashley and Emma brought dinner for everyone, turning the hospital room into an impromptu family gathering. They sat together, Richard, his daughters, Grace, Mrs. Ball, Henderson, and even Victoria, sharing stories about Margaret Anderson and her dreams for the hospital. To new beginnings, Victoria raised her paper cup of coffee. To truth, Ashley added. To love, Richard said, looking at Grace. And in that moment, they all understood. Sometimes broken hearts need more than just surgery to heal. A month after his surgery, Richard stood at the hospital board meeting, his voice strong and clear. Today, I'm proposing the creation of the Margaret Anderson Center for Cardiac Care, he announced. A facility that combines cutting-edge research with compassionate patient care. Victoria, sitting in the back row instead of her usual seat at the head table, nodded in approval. The center will focus on early detection of genetic heart conditions, Richard continued, with Dr. Grace Thompson leading our research team. Grace, who had been reviewing patient files, looked up in surprise. This wasn't part of their discussion. We'll need funding, a board member pointed out. Anderson Technologies will match all donations, Richard said, and Victoria has agreed to restructure the foundation to support this initiative. Victoria stood up. My mother's original vision was to help families affected by heart disease. It's time we honored that. After the meeting, Grace pulled Richard aside. You can't just announce things like that without asking me. Would you have said yes if I had? That's not the point. I'm still adjusting to being back in surgery. Running a research center is exactly what you've been preparing for since you lost Michael, he finished. Your research fund already saved my life. Think how many others we could help. Ashley and Emma burst into the hallway. Dad, we just heard. About the center? Richard asked. No, about our programs, Emma said excitedly. I got accepted to the hospital administration internship. And I start my medical school prerequisites next semester, Ashley added. Grace smiled. Following in your father's footsteps? Actually, Ashley looked at Grace, we were inspired by you. Victoria approached the group cautiously. The contractors need a decision about the center's location. Use the East Wing, Mrs. Henderson suggested, joining them. Margaret always said it had the best natural light for patients. Victoria opened her mother's notebook. She drew plans for it, see? She wanted healing gardens, family consultation rooms. Then that's what we'll build, Richard decided. Later that day, Grace found Richard in his old hospital room, now empty. Remembering your time as a patient, she asked. Remembering when I fell in love with my nurse, he smiled, who turned out to be a brilliant surgeon. Richard? Grace hesitated. People are talking about us, about Victoria's divorce. Let them talk. Victoria and I filed the papers this morning. No contests, no drama. It seems too easy. Victoria appeared in the doorway. It's not easy. It's right. She walked in, carrying more papers. The foundation transfer is complete. It's all yours now, Grace. Use it well. I don't know what to say. Say you'll help me become the person my mother believed I could be. Victoria replied, I'm not good at starting over. Speaking of starting over, Mrs. Henderson interrupted, wheeling in an elderly patient. Your first candidate for the new center is here. The patient, a retired teacher, had the same genetic markers as Richard. Early detection this time, Grace said, reviewing the charts. We can help. See? Richard squeezed her hand. This is why we need the center. Why we need you. Ashley and Emma arrived with lunch for everyone, turning the patient consultation into an impromptu family meeting. Mom, Emma said to Victoria, we thought maybe you could help with the center's community outreach. Victoria looked surprised. You'd want me involved? It's what Grandma would have wanted, Ashley said. Grace watched the family dynamics shift and heal. Her pager buzzed. Another cardiac case needed her attention. Go, Richard said. Save lives, that's who you are. And who are you, she asked. Someone who finally knows what matters. As Grace hurried to her patient, she passed the construction crews already measuring the east wing. Change was coming. To the hospital, to their lives, to their hearts. Mrs. Henderson watched from her volunteer station, remembering Margaret Anderson's words, sometimes the best healing happens outside the operating room. Victoria, alone with her mother's notebook, added her own notes in the margins. Plans for redemption, for growth, for becoming someone her mother would recognize. And in that moment, as families healed and hearts mended, they all understood that some surgeries fix more than just physical hearts. The hospital gardens bloomed with spring flowers as preparations for Richard and Grace's wedding took shape. Mrs. Henderson supervised volunteers hanging white lanterns while Victoria, surprisingly, arranged the flowers herself. Mom, are you sure you're okay with this? Emma asked, watching her mother work. Honestly, I'm better than okay. Victoria adjusted a centerpiece. For the first time, I'm doing something because I want to, not because society expects it. Ashley arrived with Grace's medical students in tow. Dr. Thompson's finishing rounds. She won't let even her wedding day interrupt patient care. That's our Grace, Richard said, joining them. His cardiogram results tucked in his jacket pocket showed perfect readings. Mrs. Henderson gathered everyone around. The hospital board just approved the final plans for the Margaret Anderson Center. They want to announce it at the wedding. Speaking of announcements, Victoria said, the foundation's first research grants are ready. 10 families will receive genetic testing next month. The casual observer would never guess that just months ago, these people had been trapped in a web of secrets and lies. Now they work together, rebuilding something stronger than what had broken. Grace appeared in her surgeon's coat, checking her phone. 3 successful surgeries today. The new early detection protocol is working. You should be getting ready. Richard scolded gently. The ceremony's in 2 hours. Actually, Victoria interrupted, there's something we need to show Grace first. They led her to the east wing, where construction on the new center was nearly complete. A covered plaque waited by the entrance. We couldn't wait for the official opening, Ashley explained, pulling off the cover. Grace read aloud, the Margaret Anderson Center for Cardiac Care, continuing a legacy of healing through Dr. Grace Thompson's research. Mom found more of Grandma's notebooks, Emma said. She had plans for exactly this, a place that combined research with patient care. Victoria stepped forward. I spent years trying to build my own legacy, never realizing my mother had already created one worth continuing. We all lost our way somehow, Richard added. It took a heart attack for me to see what really mattered. Mrs. Henderson appeared with Grace's old nurse uniform. Remember this? Your first day here, pretending to be just another nurse. I wasn't pretending, Grace corrected. I was learning to be a better doctor. A commotion down the hall interrupted them. One of Grace's genetic testing patients had arrived early, looking worried. Go, Richard said, understanding in his eyes. Dr. Thompson is needed. But the wedding will wait. This is who you are. This is why I love you. Grace squeezed his hand and hurried to her patient. Victoria watched her go, then turned to the others. Let's finish setting up. Everything needs to be perfect when she returns. As they worked, Ashley and Emma hung photos along the hallway. Their grandmother with patients, Victoria volunteering in her younger days, Grace performing surgery, Richard reading to children in the pediatric ward. A family history worth keeping. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. When Grace finally returned, her patient's fears relieved, she found her surgeon's coat replaced with her wedding dress, waiting in her office. Victoria helped her change. You know, I always thought power meant controlling everything. I was wrong. Real power is using your gifts to help others. Your mother knew that, Grace said softly. Yes, she did, and now, thanks to you, so do I. The hospital chapel filled with staff, patients, and families who had been touched by both Margaret Anderson's vision and Grace's dedication. Richard waited at the altar, his heart strong and steady. His daughters stood nearby, no longer the angry young women they'd been months ago. Mrs. Henderson dabbed her eyes. Margaret would have loved this. Victoria nodded, reading from her mother's notebook one last time before taking her seat, not as the ex-wife, but as family. Outside, the sun set behind the hospital where so many lives had changed, where broken hearts had healed in more ways than one. The Margaret Anderson Center stood ready to continue that legacy of healing, a testament to the power of second chances. And as Grace walked down the aisle, her face glowing with the joy of someone who had found her true path, they all understood that sometimes the greatest healing happens when we let love show us the way home. 1 year after the wedding, the Margaret Anderson Center bustled with activity. Grace, wearing her white coat with Dr. Grace Thompson Anderson embroidered on the pocket, led a group of medical students through morning rounds. Early detection is key, she explained, pointing to a patient's chart. 5 years ago, this condition would have gone unnoticed until it was too late. Victoria, now the center's community outreach director, waited at the nurse's station with donation reports. Her designer suits replaced by practical business wear, she looked more like her mother than ever. The foundation's helped 50 families this month, she announced, all receiving free genetic testing. Richard appeared with coffee for everyone. His tech company now focused exclusively on medical software, developing programs that helped identify at-risk patients. Dad, wait till you see this, Emma called from her office. As the center's new administrator, she'd implemented patient care programs that were being copied nationwide. Ashley, in her second year of medical school, joined them during her rotation. Dr. Roberts says we're getting referrals from across the country. Mrs. Henderson, still volunteering despite offers to retire, led a group of elderly patients in the garden therapy program. Just like Margaret always wanted, she smiled. Grace gathered everyone in the conference room. I have an announcement, she began. The FDA just approved our new testing protocol. Insurance companies will now cover early screening. The room erupted in cheers. This meant thousands more families would have access to life-saving tests. There's more, Victoria added. The American Heart Association wants to establish similar centers nationwide. They're using our model as the template. Richard squeezed Grace's hand. Your brother would be proud. Margaret, too, Mrs. Henderson said, holding up the old notebook. Every dream she wrote in here has come true. A young mother interrupted them, pushing her daughter in a wheelchair. Dr. Thompson, thanks to your program, they found my daughter's condition early. She's going to be okay. Grace knelt beside the little girl. Ready for your final checkup? The child hugged her. Can I be a doctor like you when I grow up? You can be anything you work hard for, Victoria answered, remembering how her own mother had encouraged her. Later that evening, the family gathered on the center's rooftop garden. String lights twinkled above the memorial wall, where photos of Margaret Anderson hung alongside thank you letters from patients. Remember when this was just an empty wing? Emma asked. Ashley laughed. Remember when Mom cared more about galas than patients? Remember when Dad thought success meant bigger profits? Emma added. Victoria smiled. We've all changed. For the better, Richard said, watching Grace check her phone for patient updates even during family time. Mrs. Henderson joined them, carrying Margaret's notebook. I found one last entry you should see. The final page contained Margaret's last written words. True healing comes not from medicine alone, but from love, compassion, and second chances. Grace looked around at her family, not just Richard and the girls, but Victoria, who'd found her mother's strength, and Mrs. Henderson, who'd kept Margaret's memory alive. This is the real American dream, she said softly. Not just success, but purpose. Not just wealth, but worth. A nurse appeared with urgent news. Their genetic screening had just identified another family at risk. Grace immediately stood up. Go, Richard smiled. Save more lives. That's what the Andersons do now, Victoria said proudly. As Grace hurried to help another family, she passed the center's mission statement, mounted in the lobby, where science meets compassion and hearts come home to heal. Richard watched his wife work, remembering the nurse who'd first captured his heart during his darkest hours. Ashley and Emma shared knowing looks, grateful for the family they'd become. Victoria held her mother's notebook close, finally understanding her true inheritance. And in every heartbeat saved, in every family healed, Margaret Anderson's legacy lived on. A testament to the power of love, the strength of forgiveness, and the healing magic of second chances. This was their American dream, not measured in dollars or social status, but in lives touched, hearts mended, and love freely given. Because sometimes the greatest success stories aren't written in bank accounts or society pages, but in the quiet moments when broken hearts find their way home to heal. The next morning brought new challenges and triumphs. Grace started her day early, leading the center's weekly case review meeting. Doctors from around the country joined virtually, eager to learn from her pioneering approach. Patient recovery rates have increased by 60% since implementing the new protocols, she explained, showing the latest data. Early detection combined with our family support program makes all the difference. In her office next door, Victoria worked with a young couple who couldn't afford genetic testing for their child. That's why we created this foundation, she told them, processing their application. My mother believed healthcare shouldn't be a privilege. The couple broke down crying. We've been turned away from 3 other hospitals. Not anymore, Victoria assured them. You're part of our family now. Down the hall, Ashley conducted her first independent patient consultation under Grace's supervision. Her approach combined her father's tech innovation with Grace's compassionate care. The tablet app Dad developed shows exactly how the procedure works, she explained to her nervous patient. See? No surprises. Emma managed the center's expanding programs from her office, juggling calls from hospitals nationwide wanting to implement their model. The key is integrating family support with medical care, she explained to a hospital board in Chicago. My grandmother understood this 40 years ago. Richard, now chairman of the hospital board, met with potential donors. His pitch was simple. He showed them his own scar. A year ago, I nearly died because no one caught this condition in time, he told them. Now we're saving families from that fate, but we need your help to reach more people. Mrs. Henderson still volunteered 3 days a week, mentoring new nurses and sharing Margaret's vision with fresh recruits. Medicine isn't just about procedures, she told them. It's about healing hearts, sometimes literally, sometimes spiritually. During lunch, the family gathered in Grace's office, sharing updates and memories. Remember Dad's first board meeting after the surgery? Emma laughed. When he announced he was selling his tech companies to focus on medical software? The shareholders thought he'd lost his mind, Ashley added. Until our first quarter results, Richard smiled. Turns out doing good is good business. Victoria arrived with surprising news. The governor's office called. They want to make our genetic screening program the state standard of care. That means insurance companies would have to cover it, Grace realized. Every family would have access. Mom would have loved this, Victoria said softly. She always said healthcare was a right, not a privilege. The afternoon brought a special visitor. The first patient Grace had saved after returning to surgery. Now fully recovered, he brought his granddaughter for a checkup. Dr. Thompson saved my life, he told the little girl. And now she's making sure we keep you healthy too. In the garden, Mrs. Henderson hosted her weekly support group for families dealing with genetic heart conditions. What started as 3 people now filled the entire space. Sharing our stories helps us heal, she reminded them. Margaret Anderson taught me that. As evening approached, Grace performed one last surgery, a complex procedure on a young mother identified through their screening program. 5 years ago, we wouldn't have caught this in time, she told her surgical team. Today, this mother will watch her children grow up. Victoria waited outside the OR, supporting the patient's family, just as Margaret once had. Her social circles had changed completely. Instead of charity galas, she now organized family support networks. After the successful surgery, the entire family gathered again on the rooftop garden. The sun set behind the hospital where their journey had begun. I got something for everyone, Richard announced, distributing small boxes. Inside each was a replica of Margaret's nursing pin, inscribed with her famous words, "Heal the heart, save the soul." To wear over our hearts, he explained, to remember what matters. Grace looked out over the city, thinking of her brother Michael. He would have loved seeing how his condition led to all this good. Isn't that the real American dream? Ashley mused. Not just succeeding yourself, but helping others succeed too? Building something bigger than yourself? Emma agreed. Creating a legacy of love, Victoria added, finally at peace with her mother's memory. Mrs. Henderson opened Margaret's notebook one last time. Margaret wrote something here I've never shared, she said. Her final entry, the night before she passed. Everyone gathered closer as she read. To whoever finds this notebook, remember that true wealth isn't counted in dollars but in lives touched. True power isn't in control, but in service. And true healing comes not just from medicine, but from love freely given and graciously received. This hospital isn't just a building, it's a home for broken hearts to heal, both literal and metaphorical. May all who enter these doors find not just treatment, but transformation. And may my legacy live on not in plaques or prizes, but in every life saved, every family supported, and every heart healed. Grace wiped away tears as she received an alert. Another family had just been identified through their screening program. Go, everyone said in unison, smiling. As she hurried to help another family, Grace passed the wall of photos in the lobby. Margaret Anderson with her patients, Victoria finding her mother's strength, the twins following their new dreams, Richard discovering his true purpose, and their own wedding day. Below the photos hung the center's promise to every patient. Here, we believe in second chances. Here, we believe in healing more than just hearts. Here, we believe in the power of love to transform lives. Here, we believe in you. Because sometimes the greatest dreams aren't about reaching the top, but about helping others rise. Sometimes the truest success isn't measured in wealth, but in worth. And sometimes the most powerful healing comes not from medicine alone, but from hearts that break, mend, and grow stronger together. This was their American dream. Not a story of individual success, but of collective healing. Not a tale of personal triumph, but of family transformation. A dream big enough to encompass them all, yet intimate enough to touch each heart that passed through their doors. And in every beat of every heart they saved, Margaret Anderson's vision lived on. A legacy of love that would continue to heal hearts and transform lives for generations to come. Friends, if this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late for a second chance. What would you do if love gave you an unexpected opportunity to start over? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us that true success isn't measured by what we have, but by the lives we touch. Remember, sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin right after the moments we think the story is over.